Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be reviewing the very first foreign language Agatha Christie adaptation I ever watched many years ago, the Japanese anime series Agatha Christie's Great Detectives Poirot and Marple, which first aired in 2004 and 2005. It was one season long, 39 episodes that adapted mostly short stories, but some novels as well. This entire series is available for free on YouTube with English subtitles, so it's readily available. And I found this series delightful. It is animated, of course, but there is a sophistication to it. The main audience was children, obviously, but it's not really kidified in any way. And I'll give a series overview and go through each of the stories adapted. And to be honest, I don't have a lot to say about the individual stories, but I did want to highlight the series and do this video anyway. I won't be spoiling anything other than to say this series is extremely faithful to the text. I don't believe any solutions were changed. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. The main character in the series is not Hercule Poirot nor Miss Marple, although they both have a heavy presence. The main character is actually Mabel West, who is 16 years old and is Miss Marple's great niece. She is Raymond West's daughter. And this character is an original creation for the series, although Miss Marple does have a niece named Mabel Denman in the short story Thumb Mark of St. Peter, who I think this character is supposed to be based off of. The other original character here is Oliver, Mabel's pet duck, who doesn't get much to do, unfortunately, but he is adorable, and he's very good at ripping disguises off of people. Mabel works as Poirot's junior assistant. So she goes back and forth between London and with Poirot and St. Mary Mead with Miss Marple. And true to Christie's text, Poirot and Marple never meet, and the other is not often mentioned when it's not their case. But there is good continuity in merging these two worlds. Poirot's usual crew is present. Hastings, Miss Lemon are both there. Inspector Japp is also there, but he's been renamed Inspector Sharp for what I can only imagine is cultural reasons. Inspector Sharp is a canonical character. He appears in Hickory Dickory Dock, but this character is Inspector Japp, just with the name Sharp. I think that's pretty clear. And the series is set in 1930s England, so some stories did have their setting moved. The overall sort of tone here is British, despite this being a Japanese production. There are like tiny traces of Japanese culture influencing things, mainly in the way people talk to each other. There's also a lot of tea in this series because tea is very popular in both England and Japan. So tea is used to give this like tiny bit of Japanese influence while maintaining the British setting. And I'll apologize here. I don't know any Japanese whatsoever, so I'm not going to try to pronounce anything in Japanese, including the names of the voice actors, but they're all fantastic and deserve their due. Whenever a character appears on screen for the first time, their name is printed and the major characters have their voice actor's name. So they do get the recognition, and I do want to highlight those voice actors because they were very good. I'll go story by story, as some stories cover multiple episodes. The premiere story is a single episode adaptation of Jewel Robbery at the Grand Metropolitan. And this was a good one to start with because the mystery is very quick, but very good, and it provides the opportunity to introduce most of the characters. Mabel is 16 years old, and she's stuck in this really boring girls' school. I like to think it's Meadowbank School, but the name is not mentioned because her father, Raymond West, is still an idiot in the series, and he's rich and kind of stuffy. He doesn't understand why Mabel hates the school, and he's not a tyrant necessarily, but he's just mostly clueless. And Mabel is at the Grand Metropolitan because her father is throwing this lavish party for a bunch of boring people when the jewel theft occurs. Mabel is fascinated by Poirot. She is eager to help and observe him at work. She's just so amazed as she begs her father to let her leave school so she can work with Poirot. Poirot is, a little skeptical about her because she's young, but he's willing to oblige her. Poirot, I think, is actually a lot nicer and kinder in this series than he is in the books. That's probably one of the bigger changes regarding him because he can be a little mean sometimes, but this is a kid's series technically, so they make him kinder and gentler. Hastings and Miss Lemon are actually more hostile to Mabel, at least initially. And then we have Oliver, who gets loose during the party, and it causes like a big ruckus, which Raymond West hates. But Mabel was so fascinated with Poirot here. She wants nothing else to be his assistant. And I thought, there's a good adaptation of this short story, and it also did a good job of incorporating this sort of introductory content into the episode. The second story adapted is another one episode adaptation, this time called The Riddle of the Cheap Flat, an adaptation of The Adventure of the Cheap Flat. And this is one of my favorite short stories, but unfortunately, I think this episode falls a little flat. I think it missed sort of the spirit of the short story. Mabel does drop out of school and tries to prove herself to Poirot, who is a little hesitant. Hastings is actually a little intimidated by Mabel, and Miss Lemon just wants nothing to do with her. For me, the way this story is flat is because Mabel is the one who tries to rent the cheap flat and is turned away, while the next people who come in are accepted. I think that sort of like ruins the theme of the story because there's a very good reason why Mabel is turned down for the flat. It's because she's a child. This even gets mentioned in the episode, whereas in the short story it's adults who are turned down in favor of other adults. That creates a much more intriguing and believable mystery. But in the end, Poirot accepts Mabel as his junior partner, and the episode is not bad. It's just I think it missed the intrigue of the short story. Our third story is the very first to feature Miss Marple in here, a one episode adaptation of Strange Jest called Strange Will. And this is the only adaptation of Strange Jest in any language. This series is actually the only adaptation we have of quite a few of these Miss Marple short stories. And this is a pretty standard adaptation, not much to just really discuss here, as will be the case with some of these moving forward. I think the story just really shows off who Miss Marple is. This kindly, gentle woman with a shrewd mind and a keen eye for human nature and noticing things. The couple approaches Miss Marple because they know of her ability to solve this kinds of puzzles, which involve, a missing will and some cryptic clues. It was a good adaptation. Not much to say about it. The fourth story is another one episode adaptation, this of The Faultless Maid, which is an adaptation of The Case of the Perfect Maid. Again, as far as I'm aware, this is the only adaptation in any language of this short story. And I love this short story, and this is a Miss Marple one. This is a very hard story to adapt because it involves, slight spoiler here, impersonations. And even in the animation, you can kind of tell, because this is animated, I think the series could have done more with it. But this is still a great story and a great adaptation of the story, despite, I think, a bit of a missed opportunity. And a bit of an Easter egg, the fired maid, Gladys, bears a very strong resemblance to another maid named Gladys, from Pocketful of Rye. She looks exactly like the actress who played her in the Joan Hickson adaptation. This anime does not adapt a Pocketful of Rye, but I think that would have been a fun lead-in. Actually, the Miss Marple figure in this anime is clearly modeled from Joan Hickson, while Poirot looks oddly similar to David Suchet. The first novel to be adapted is the four-part story of the ABC murders, also the first to feature a murder or murders, as is the case. And when the series does do a murder story, they're very cautious with it. They avoid showing the dead body, and the way they talk about like a violence or murder, it's a little more kid friendly. It's still not kiddie, but I do think they make it a little more appropriate for younger audiences. And there's not much to discuss here, as this is a very faithful adaptation. It's very good. The one qualm I would have is that the killer doesn't really come into the story until the third episode, I believe, which I can excuse. That's the nature of the beast when adapting the ABC murders. That's always going to happen. And, the ABC murders is one that's very popular adapted. A lot of different sort of series and films have adopted the ABC murders, even more so than not more so than Murder on the Orient Express, but probably third after that story and Death on the Nile. Next up, we have a two-parter, The Prime Minister's Disappearance, which is an adaptation of The Kidnapped Prime Minister. And the story was the most affected, I would say, by the change in the time period, because we are now in the 1930s. There is a heavy anti-Nazi theme to this one. The story is a little different than the short story, but it's nothing too noteworthy. It's a very solid adaptation. Again, this one is more of a thriller with Poirot, then it comes across as a traditional mystery novel. There's no murder or anything. It's more of the adventure sort of aspects here, and I thought this was a good one to adapt, to see Mabel in this kind of environment. But again, not too much to discuss here. Another two-parter, The Riddle of the Egyptian Tomb, or The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. Again, extremely faithful to the original story. Mabel travels with Poirot and Hastings to Egypt to investigate these deaths that have been happening. And this is a bit of a breakthrough episode for Mabel. She's starting to feel part of the team as Poirot lets her travel with him. She's no longer doing sort of the more like boring, menial aspects of detective work. And there's a good story to adapt because it has wide appeal. The mystery is very good. The ancient Egyptian theme is always a very popular one. It shows off Christie's penchant for for archaeology. And I'm saying this a lot, but this series is geared toward children. But this is a story that children and adults will love. And I think it's a very good episode to demonstrate that. Mabel heads back to St. Mary Mead for a bit. We have the episode adaptation of The Tape Measure Murderer. Again, the only adaptation of this story that I'm aware of. And I've always loved this story. It's very creative and it's a very good short story. And this is a very faithful adaptation. I almost wish it wasn't so faithful, though. I mean, first of all, and this is unavoidable, but the title is like a colossal spoiler. But there are also like little other details that the show highlights in like a little too obvious way. But again, that's the way it's written in the short story collection, and they're just maintaining that. I wish they had toned things down a little bit, made it a little less obvious, maybe change the title. A lot of the title changes in English, I think, are just because they're like English titles translated into Japanese and then translated back to English. But I do wish, even if they had just changed the title here a little bit, it would have just been like a much better story. Our next story is a one episode adaptation of Ingots of Gold called The Case of the Gold Ingots. Again, this is the only existing adaptation of this story. And this is one of the 13 problems, and it was Raymond West's story to tell in that series, and the anime kept that format here. In the original, Raymond West tells this story, and the other guests are supposed to solve it. Of course, he's an idiot and didn't even know the solution. But here, Miss Marple is telling the story to Mabel, in which her father got caught up in this like gold hunt with some nefarious characters, as Raymond West is wont to do. I know because of that, there isn't actually like that much for Miss Marple or Mabel to do in this one. It's largely a younger Raymond West, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with this format, but I did wish Mabel and Miss Marple had a more active hand in it. But the series strived to remain as faithful as possible to the original text, and this is still a job very well done. Next up is a one episode adaptation of The Blue Geranium, also from the 13 Problems, and the format is once again preserved. Miss Marple and Mabel are called in after the murder, and the story is largely told in flashback. Again, I wish they were more active, but I understand the show is trying to preserve the original formatting. And this is still a very strong and faithful adaptation. It's not boring by any means. Again, this mystery does involve an impersonation, and you can kind of tell. I just think with animation, it should be easier to hide these impersonations, but the show is trying to play fair, which I understand. It would be unfair to animate two characters who are the same person to look totally different. I get it, but I still wish something more had been done. But, it's still a great episode. We have a three-part story called Mystery of End House, an adaptation of Peril at End House. And this one does have some changes for streamlining purposes. The Crofts are gone, and the subplot involving drug smuggling is also gone. But there are still mentions of drug use. It's very slight, but it is there, which is a bit surprising given the demographic audience. But I've noticed in other sort of media as well, the Japanese don't often shy away from more mature or adult themes in programming geared toward children. And this is otherwise a very faithful adaptation of Peril at End House. Is very streamlined because this runtime is only 3 episodes, while most novels are given 4, but still, I felt it was very good. I didn't feel like it lacked anything or they were cutting things or dragging things out. It's a pretty solid adaptation. We have 2 Christmas stories in a row here. First is a two-parter of The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. And this was a good one to do. Of course, I would have preferred, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, as that's my favorite Christie novel. But this one is a better fit for children because there are children characters in it. And again, it's very faithful and a very good adaptation. I will say I was a bit surprised they did this one because Christmas is not like an extremely popular holiday in Japan. A lot of There are a lot of Buddhists in Japan. Not there's like a small, like a large minority of Christians there, but to celebrate Christmas like this, I thought it was a very good idea. And again, this one don't have a lot to say about it. It was good. It was faithful. Not much else to say. The other Christmas story is the four-part adaptation of 450 from Paddington, although they did remove the Christmas elements, but they still aired it at Christmas time. And the show actually takes a page from the Margaret Rutherford adaptation of this book by eliminating Lucy Islesbarrow and making Mabel take her place as a housekeeper. And this makes a lot of sense just from like an in-story perspective. It puts Mabel right in the thick of things. It's a bit awkward in the book where Lucy has to like keep calling Miss Marple, and while Mabel still does that, it isn't as awkward because she's also investigating and taking an active hand in it herself. And of course, this eliminates all of like the love story with Lucy's suitors and all that. Mabel has a good relationship with the other children, Alexander Eastley and James Stoddard West. They form a bit of a trio here, and then we have Oliver causing quite a bit of mischief in this one, which angers Luther Krakenthorpe. I did find the characters to be a bit kinder than they were in the books. Again, keeping with that tone of the series. My one quibble would be the murderer isn't like really in this adaptation as much as I think they needed to be. But again, and I sound like a broken record. These are good episodes, entertaining, faithful to the original. Next up is a two-part edition of the Plymouth Express, and this is a short story that Christie expanded into the mystery of the Blue Train. Again, very faithful. This is actually a very important story for Mabel because this is the first time she's allowed to investigate one of Poirot's cases on her own. Poirot trusts her to do so. There's also a big case for Oliver, who finds evidence all on his own here for the first time. I do find the story to be one of like the lesser ones the show adapted, but that's not the show's fault. It's a perfectly good episode, faithfully adapted, not much to discuss otherwise. Next up is one episode for Motive versus Opportunity. Again, the only adaptation existing for this short story that I'm aware of. And to me, this was an odd one to pick because it has a lot in common with Strange Jest. But it was pretty good. This is another 13 Problems short story, and they once again try to keep the format of the collection by having Mr. Pretherick appear, and he gets Miss Marple involved. I've always enjoyed this story where there's a missing will, and the people who benefit from that will are the only people who could have stolen it but have no reason to do so, while the people who had reason to steal the will didn't have the opportunity to do so. And Miss Marple and Mabel are more active in this one. This isn't like the Blue Geranium or Ingots of Gold, where the entire thing is told in flashback and Miss Marple solves it. Again, another very strong entry. I guess I wish it was just a little different from Strange Jest. They have a lot in common, and there's many other, Miss Marple short stories I think could have been fun in this place. We have a two-parter called The Disappearing Cook, which is an adaptation of The Adventure of the Clapham Cook. And I enjoyed this one as well, but I felt 2 episodes were a bit much. I think 1 episode would have sufficed. It's not that it drags on or anything, or they, inserted new plot points, but I did feel as if it was a little stretched out more than it needed to be to fill the 2 parts. It's not my favorite story, but, I always loved how dismissive Poirot is of, like, the woman and her missing cook, and, like, how she keeps screaming this is an emergency, and Poirot's like, a missing cook is not an emergency. I thought the show did a good job with it overall. Again, I think this probably could have been 1 episode. Next up is a 4-part adaptation of Sleeping Murder, and this is the final Miss Marple story to appear in the series. Now, I thought this was a good one. Sleeping Murder gets adapted a lot, and I can understand why, because it's a very simple story, and you can do a lot with it, and I appreciated how the series handled the plot. They don't tone down the talk about Helen and her suitors, and they don't steer away from that nasty talk about how man-crazy Helen allegedly was. They make it appropriate for younger audiences, but they still keep this maturity about it and don't turn it down too much. The story and the tone is largely intact. It's very faithful. I think this was a good one to end Miss Marple's appearances with. This is technically the last Miss Marple novel published, although I would say Nemesis is the last true Miss Marple, but it's also very understandable why this series, wouldn't want to do that novel. I think this is an adaptation that handles a lot of the bouncing around very well. The Lily Kimball murder is a great scene here. To me, this is one of the best adaptations from the series. We have another one episode adaptation, this one of 4 and 20 Blackbirds, called 24 Japanese Thrushes. And this is one of my favorite short stories, and the show did another fantastic job. I don't have a lot to comment on. I thought it was a very fun adaptation. I think the impersonation aspects of the story are done better here than it is in other episodes that had impersonations. It's far less obvious to me in this episode what was going on than in the others. I mean, of course, I knew what was going on, but, again, very good adaptation. One of my favorites from the series. We're getting towards the end here, and I do think they end largely on a good note. We have one more one episode adaptation, that of the disappearance of Mr. Davenheim, called The Case of Davenheim's Disappearance. And to me, this was a weaker episode. I'm not the biggest fan of this just story. And while it's adapted fine, it just like isn't my favorite. There's nothing wrong with the episode, but I'd rather watch the episode than read the story. But again, perfectly fine adaptation, not much to comment on. And the series finale is a four-parter of Death in the Clouds. And this one, I believe, is the only story to have both Poirot and Marple in it. They don't meet, and Miss Marple's appearances are mostly her writing letters to Mabel as she goes back and forth on, the plane to France and England. It's nice they didn't excise Miss Marple from the finale. This is a very good adaptation. I like this one better than the Suchet Poirot version. I find the animation to be perfectly suited for this story, and it skips over all the drudging details. Poirot is very motivated to clear his own name. And I just found all the impersonation stuff, like when Norman Gale pretends to blackmail Lady Horbury, just work better when animated. The show plays up the more fun aspects of the novel, and it works very well, and especially with again the animation here. I'm not sure why this is the finale. It just ends like any other episode. I'm not sure if there was another season planned, or they had more episodes or what, but I enjoyed this one a lot. It ended perfectly fine. Again, I don't necessarily need to have a conclusion, but again, I wish there were more episodes. This series was completely delightful, and it's a shame we didn't get more of it. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about this series. No, I'm sorry, I didn't have a lot to say about some of these specific episodes, but I did want to highlight this lesser known series because it's absolutely delightful. Next week, I begin a two-part series of ranking the best one-time Christie characters. These characters will only have appeared in one Christie novel and are not either the victims or the murderer. I already ranked all the murderers and the top 15 victims, so these are all the other one-time characters. So stay tuned for that. And in the community section, I did post my schedule for the rest of the summer, or most of the rest of the summer, through September 9th, so in case you're interested in what's coming up. Until next time, Mystery Files.